Okay, let me try the sound again. It's not going to be an English class, but the seminar will be in English. I hope that's okay for all of you. Should we start? Yes, but you can come either here or you can already sit here.
Yeah. Do you prefer yellow or orange? Yeah.
Oh, wow.
It's a major decision.
Okay. Are we already streaming? Or?
Just a second. I'm waiting for Martin to give me a sign. Yes, we are.
Okay. Great.
So, hello, my name is Claudia. I want to welcome you here, both the people online and you on-site. Thank you for coming. And before I give the floor to Michał and to our guest, Justin Solomon, let me just tell you that we're going to have a lecture by Justin for the first approximately an hour. Later on, we're going to have questions and answers. So I hope you have a lot of questions to Justin, and we'll squeeze your, seize the opportunity that you're here. And later on, we'll take some questions from YouTube. So anybody who has a question, please post them, and our colleagues are taking care that your questions will be will reach Justin at the end of the meeting. So great to have you here, Michał Karpowicz. Please.
Should I use two mics or one is enough? I just. Hi, welcome everyone. I'm very happy to have you here. Welcome to our nask scientific seminar. We have wonderful weather today. Yesterday, when Justin was landing, I don't know if you remember, there was a snowstorm here, so Justin brought great weather. I'm very happy to have Justin here in Warsaw. He's a professor at MIT, principal investigator and leader of Geometric Data Processing Group, or Geometric Data Processing Group, or is it both?
Something like that.
So we'll hear more about that. He's author of a wonderful textbook on numerical algebra, numerical processing, and he's author of many wonderful papers in topics in machine learning and applying numerical methods in machine learning. And also, he's a musician, so he plays cello and piano, and that's really something I will probably ask more about later. Justin, great to have you here. Welcome to Warsaw.
Thank you so much.
The floor is yours.
I really appreciate it. I appreciate the kind introduction. This is a very intimidating setup in here. Where should I stand? Is this fine? Cool. And there's slides and a clicker or something. All right, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here and to meet all of you. So Michał asked me to give a pretty mathematical talk, so I apologize in advance. Hopefully, the content is correct, but at any point, if you have questions for me, or if it's too fast or too slow or uninteresting, please just let me know, and it's my pleasure to clarify. So I'm here today visiting you from our research group at MIT back in Boston. I seem to have brought Boston weather with me, although I think it's roughly the same as Warsaw, at least this time of year. So at MIT, I lead a pretty big research group that studies a lot of different problems, basically in applied geometry. So when you think about geometry problems in computer science and computation, machine learning, and so on, there are many different perspectives that we tend to think about. On the one hand, of course, there's a lot of data out there that really is geometric in nature. So for instance, our research group has many collaborations in autonomous driving, robotics, computer graphics, simulation, fields where really there are tangible three-dimensional shapes that you're working with and manipulating and trying to understand. We're good?
Yes,
okay. And on the other hand, oftentimes when we talk about statistics and machine learning, we use geometric language, right? We talk about proximity of data points, how well different things overlap, distances, and so on. So essentially, the thesis that our research group has been pursuing is that these two perspectives aren't that far apart. So related to our introduction here, essentially the high-level idea here is that you can kind of parse the name of our group in two different ways, right? So roughly half of my students and postdocs are studying problems involving geometric data. We were one of the early research groups that was studying, for example, machine learning applied to point clouds, which is the typical modality that goes into autonomous driving through LiDAR sensors. And on the other hand, we have other folks who are statisticians, optimization experts, and so on, who are studying high-dimensional problems in geometry applied to understanding data sets. So today, we'll mostly be in that second category. I'm going to tell you about some of our group's research involving sort of abstract machine learning problems and how a geometric perspective can help you tackle some of these challenges that come up in practice. But of course, since I'm here for 2 days, it's my pleasure to chat with any of you about any of the topics of expertise in our group and to learn more about the problems that you all are studying. So my background is in low-dimensional geometry, and actually I used to work in computer graphics domain, and largely still do. Actually, I was at an animation studio before starting graduate school. And of course, in that community, we're very familiar with geometry problems that look something like what I've shown you on this slide here, right? We're given, for example, 2 3-dimensional shapes. I believe this is the brain of a faculty member and a postdoc in neuroscience at Stanford. And as we know, there's some common structure and a lot that's probably different between these 2 individuals. And geometry tools really are at the base of how we study 3-dimensional shapes, how we understand data that comes up in medical imaging and other domains and so on. And we've developed a lot of expertise and intuition on how to compare geometric objects, tell people how they're similar, how they're different, and so on. But more recently, we've been applying exactly the same kind of reasoning to more abstract data. So for example, many of you here, I'm guessing, are familiar with generative modeling tools out there, for example, DALL-E and whatever the latest ChatGPT is. And in some sense, you can understand some of the models they use for training these tools as solving a geometry problem. On the one hand, you have some data set, like maybe in 1 dimension, it's these red dots here. On the other hand, you have some model or distribution, which is trying to describe how your generative tool is generating new, sampling from the space of images or text or what have you. And in some sense, the algorithms in this domain are attempting to bring these 2 things close together. And really, if you read the theory behind these techniques, you can think of them as minimizing some kind of notion of distance, right? On the one hand, you have your data set, on the other hand, you have your model, and you'd like them to be close together. And so a lot of the tools that originally we were using to think about these 3-dimensional problems are actually quite similar to the ones that are being used now in these more abstract and high-dimensional settings. And we'll see that really some of the geometric algorithms that our group originally intended for computer vision domain are now mostly being applied in this space. And then finally, these days, one problem that our group has really cared about a lot and has been studying involves navigating and understanding the geometry of lost landscapes. So oftentimes in machine learning, we talk about very large-scale optimization problems. If we're lucky, they're convex, but these days they typically are not. And we can use geometric language to understand the space of optimal solutions to a given machine learning problem, the different models that it can explain my data, and so on. So in today's talk, essentially the argument I'm trying to make is that geometry isn't just a 2D or a 3D problem. It's not just in the domain of computer graphics and vision, but really that kind of language and modeling and thinking are applicable to these high-dimensional problems in statistics as well. So the high-level theme for today that I thought I'd tell you about some of our research in involves whether we can identify and leverage geometric structure in abstract data. So if you are presented with some data set in a different domain area, a priori, that data set might not feel too geometric for you. I have a bunch of survey responses or information out there that I've gathered from the internet. It's not so clear what the right notion of geometry and shape is to understand such an object. So the first question is, how can we identify that kind of structure, whether it's some low-dimensional thing? You're all probably familiar with principal component analysis and these sort of classical techniques, which in some sense are trying to get at that notion, or some more advanced methods. And then once we've found that geometric structure, how do we leverage it to formulate algorithms that understand the shape of your data set and then use it to infer new ideas and structure? So in particular, I'll tell you about kind of 3 threads in our research group. I'm glancing at my watch and I'm already talking too much, so we'll see how far we get, and if we have to stop early, that's okay. And essentially, these are 3 instances of sort of the intersection of geometry and machine learning applied in 3 different spaces. So first, I'll tell you a little bit about comparing data points and really trying to infer geometry on a data set that doesn't have it initially. So in this setting, maybe we're presented with some time-varying sequence of information, and we suspect that there's some geometric structure that's governing how it's changing over time, but we're not sure exactly what it is. And our task is to try and reverse engineer what geometry on our problem makes sense and how we can use that to predict the future, infer missing data points, and so on. Next, we'll put geometry on data sets themselves. How can I compare whether 2 data sets are similar? So for example, if I carry out machine learning on one data set, I learn how to distinguish cats from dogs in one set of photos, and now I have another data set with its own bias, can I measure how similar or different these objects are? In some sense, you can view this task as itself a geometry task, right? There's some notion of proximity, in this case, not between data points, but between entire sets of data at a time. And then finally, we'll step a little bit to the side, and we'll talk a bit about the geometry of loss functions and loss landscapes, and some of our group's most recent work in the area of optimization, in particular this sort of proximal operator techniques, which can be used to capture when a machine learning model might have more than one optima, and how those explain your data in different fashion. So that's our sort of high-level plan, and of course, again, I'm talking too much, so we'll see how far we get. Okay, and please stop me at any point if there are any questions. I'm talking too fast, too slow, you're bored of the equations, anything is totally fine. And there's a microphone there. All right, so let's get started by talking about inferring geometry on the set of data points. So here's an example task that our research group has been studying. So this is borrowed from this sort of biological setup. I'm not an expert in this, so to my colleagues who know more about computational biology, I apologize in advance, but I'll see if I can explain these scRNA data sets in a reasonable fashion. So there's a lot of time when there's technology out there that can measure gene expression. So I have a collection of cells, and over time, the cells undergo some process. For example, maybe they start all as stem cells, and they slowly differentiate into different specialized biological objects. And this is a process that happens over time. It, of course, is sensitive to the setting and biological variation and so on. But a very typical result of an experiment looks something like this. So here, the color axis here is time. And what I can do is I can take a little collection of cells, and I can allow them over time to differentiate for some period. And then I put it into my imaging technology, and what I get out is gene expression. So like I have basically a long binary vector saying like these genes I see observed in these cells, these ones I do not. Right? And so this is a probabilistic process. I have a whole collection of cells, and there's some likelihood maybe they turn into muscle cell, muscle tissue, and some other likelihood that they develop into something else. Right? And the longer that time evolves, the more they kind of differentiate and change. But there's a problem in these experiments, which is that when I do that imaging, when I actually measure gene expression, I kill the cells. So I have a collection of cells, I let them evolve until for 10 days, and then I can get this one snapshot in time after 10 days of what this looks like. And I can repeat this experiment many times. So if you think about the basic setting here, every time I repeat this experiment, I get some notion at one fixed time, so measured in days since I started my experiment, of all the different genes that tend to be expressed after that amount of evolution or change. But there's no correspondence, right? The cells are different every experiment because I killed them. And so, unfortunately, what I'd like to infer is, given one cell, what is their likely trajectory, right? Like, given the gene expression at time, at day 5, where do I expect that cell to look at day 10? But I can't actually infer that because I have a whole collection of things that I've sort of experimented with at a time. And so this is a great example where I'm trying to infer some geometry. I expect that these things kind of change in some continuous fashion. But unfortunately, it's not obvious. I get sort of entire data sets worth of information every time I run this experiment. And so this is the setting that sort of motivated some of our research here. the common tool that we'll use to study this problem is a mathematical theory called optimal transport. This is an area that I've had a lot of expertise and worked in for many years. If you're not familiar, it's a very familiar story, certainly in Boston. Here's an image of a snowstorm right outside of my office, and I'm guessing it's actually probably a little bit worse in Warsaw here. But essentially, the optimal transport problem has to do with moving around piles of snow or piles of sand. So the basic mathematical theory here is that I have some probability distribution, right? So some distribution of mass over a piece of land. So for example, here, maybe it's on the front yard of MIT here. All photos of MIT look the same because there's only one camera angle that looks nice. It's kind of a boring campus. But in any event, then maybe I want to build a snowman. So I'd like to take that snow and put it in some other configuration. And of course, there are many ways that I could do that, right? I could be very inefficient about it and take like 1 inch of snow off of the entire top of my front lawn, one little handful at a time, and move it a very long distance. Or I could try to do something more efficient. And so the theory of optimal transport is all about how to do that in the most efficient possible way. In other words, I have some distribution of mass at 2 points in time, and I'd like the most likely explanation for how that mass moved around under the assumption that I'm lazy, right? I want to move things as little as possible. So if you translate that into mathematics, you get this kind of scary-looking integral problem here. But essentially, the way that you can understand it is as follows. So if you think of pi here as the amount of snow that I picked up at x and dropped off at y, then essentially, the cost function for this problem is saying that I'd like to minimize the amount of work, which is measured as mass, multiplied by the distance that it traveled. Right? And so over all of the possible ways that I can pick up snow and drop it back down, what I'm looking to do is to find the most efficient one. Right? And that minimum value is called the optimal transport cost. Now, this is a problem that's been studied by mathematicians for many, many years. It has its history going back, I think, 100, 200 years, back to Monge, if not earlier. Kantorovich got the Nobel Prize for studying these problems in the 1960s. And these days, we apply it in very high-dimensional machine learning settings, right? We often think of these piles of snow as like my data set and my model, like I mentioned before, and I'm trying to bring these two things closer together. But there's an underlying assumption in the optimal transport problem, which is that I know this distance function. I know d of xy. So in other words, I know how much work it is to pick up, a unit of snow and walk 10 feet with it and drop it back down. Or like, what, 2 meters or so? I don't know. OK. But in any event, that assumption for this cell data set is a little bit difficult to actually carry out in practice. If you think about it, these vectors of gene expression are often extremely long, and it's not clear what geometry to put there, right? Like, are genes correlated with one another? Which ones are predictive of this process that changes over time, and so on. So the baseline kind of geometry that I need to apply a tool like optimal transport, which feels useful for understanding how these cells are evolving, I don't have that a priori. And so we have this inverse problem. In particular, here we have different pairs of probability measures. Think about this as the gene expression at different points in time, like day 5 and day 10. And now I'd like to infer the geometry. I'd like to infer that function d that brings these things close together. Hopefully we understand the basic setup. So for example, here's a very simplified problem that's a synthetic that my student Chris generated here. So let's say rather than having genes that are evolving in some 1,000-dimensional space, I'm just in the plane, and I have something just moving along a circle, then what I'd like to infer is that the cost of data points moving in this sort of circular arc over time is somehow lower than cutting in a straight line, which is what a priori the optimal transport problem would do. Okay? So now we're going to add a little bit of mathematics to our problem, just a bit, and then we'll step back and see some nice results. So here, remember that, so here we're going to use the letter W to signify this optimal transport problem, but we're going to think of W as sort of a function not just of my snow, which I'm going to call like row 1 and row 0 here. So this would be like my gene expression at day 5 and day 10, and then day 10 and day 15. But also G, which is like the geometry of my problem. Okay, so I'm going to solve kind of an interesting problem, which is to reverse engineer the geometry of my problem so that my gene expressions are kind of close to each other as they evolve over time. Now, there's a very easy way to solve the problem the way that I've stated it, which is to take the entire space of gene expression and put them at 0, because then everything is very close. And so what we need to do is add a term to our problem that makes sure we get a non-trivial solution, right? That our solution to our problem is interesting. And so in addition to that, we're going to have a second term, R, which is, stands for regularizer, which is going to make sure that this whole thing doesn't degenerate. hopefully, at least at a high level, this problem makes some sense. Now, mathematically, the way that we're going to capture geometry is using something called a Riemannian metric. If you're not familiar with what that means, it means that if I'm sitting at a data point, I can sort of give myself some ruler for how to measure distances in different directions. So for example, maybe I look at the gene expression vector for a given cell, and I say that it's somehow easy for the cell to move in one direction, like to evolve in a particular way, and it's much more difficult to evolve in some other way. Right? And so mathematically, we can represent that with a positive definite matrix per data point. Okay. So here's a nasty equation. I think we can actually probably mostly omit it. But in case you're familiar a little bit with the mathematical sort of theory of optimal transport, I'll give you a little bit of detail about our model, and I'll refer you to our paper for more information. So the optimal transport problem is actually a convex one, which is really nice. It means that it has sort of one optimal value regardless of where you start optimizing. And moreover, we can leverage something called duality to write down an alternative form of this transport problem. So essentially, for every problem that involves transporting snow, there's actually an equivalent problem that involves pricing, like how much cost I have to pay to pick up and drop off snow. That's actually exactly the same. So you can think of it as a duality of kind of like there's the consumer that's trying to minimize their price, like their work, and then there's also on the other side of duality, there's like a company that's trying to maximize their profit, and that somehow there's an equilibrium between these two problems. So we actually leverage that latter formulation to solve this particular one. And the reason that we do that is that we can solve it using essentially an unconstrained problem. So the inner term here, this thing with all these integrals, is exactly the transport problem we had before. I think it's okay to ignore all the mathematical symbols and just think of it that way. And then we're adding a second term, which is our regularizer. Okay? Now the reason that we have this nice formulation here is that essentially it's quite easy to actually evaluate this thing probabilistically. So at the end of the day, our optimization algorithm for this problem is actually quite straightforward. What we do is alternate between two steps. One of them takes all of our data and solves that optimal transport problem. So I have those gene expression sequences, and like between day 1 and day 2, day 3, day 4, and so on, I basically solve that transport problem given a fixed guess of what I think the geometry should be. Right? So in other words, with my current hypothesis of how gene evolution should look, what would be the cost of the data that I observed? And then I kind of freeze that transport problem, and I try to improve my geometry to align with the matching that I computed. So maybe I'll skip over some of these details and just go to some images of what this looks like. So here's some synthetic examples where we have a data set, or a sequence of data sets. So here the color is like time, and the data points are shown on the plane here. And the Riemannian metric we represent using these arrows, right? So the arrows are kind of like the directions where we think that the mass in our problem should move. And you can notice that after we solve this optimization problem, rather than kind of an isotropic geometry to our problem, like in other words, it's equally likely that our data can move in any direction, we've inferred that these data points tend to move, for example, in a circle or in this cross pattern here. So that's the kind of inference that we're hoping to do. If we go back to that strRNA data, we can actually solve some inference problems here. So for example, let's say that I have this data set, but I only sample it every 3 days or every 15 days or something like that. And I'd like to guess what the cells look like in between those points in time. Right? Then what I can do is I can use this machinery to kind of infer the geometric structure. And then I can predict the path that these different cells are taking in between the points in time when I've actually done my experiment. Or similarly, maybe I can infer what happens in the future by kind of just extrapolating along a given path. Finally, here's a kind of a fun data set that my student Chris, who of course was the main person who was working on this, found online. We were playing with looking at trajectories of birds. So apparently people will attach little GPS sensors to birds and then observe them as they fly around, for example, here, the west coast of the United States up into Canada over time. So if you have a collection of birds, they migrate up and down the coast. And they have a very specific notion of geometry in their mind. They'd like to avoid flying over bodies of water. Maybe some areas are warmer or colder. There's better wind and so on. So that notion of geometry is not the same as what we might use to fly an airplane. So it's actually exactly the kind of data that we study in this project, because these GPS sensors apparently just send a little ping saying, like, there's a bird here at this time. Doesn't say which one. And so by running these kinds of algorithms, we can do a really fun kind of inference task where you can simply predict, like, what is the trajectory of a bird as it migrates over time. And what we see is that, of course, this is not a problem we expect to solve accurately. Birds, it turns out, are extremely unpredictable creatures. But we can kind of understand from a high level what are the kind of patterns in migration that we see over time in this data, and how might different species compare to one another. OK. So this is our sort of first example of inferring geometry in data, right? We started with some data set like, bird trajectories over time, positions of birds, and so on. And the task we're trying to infer is what is, geometry does the bird have in mind, right? How can we compare these data sets, these time-evolving data points, in a way that now we can predict the future or understand what happens in between places where we actually have data points. And the second thing that I'll tell you about, we're going to now put we're going to put geometry not on the space of points, data points, but rather on the space of data sets. And this is a task that happens a lot in machine learning, even if we don't give it exactly that name. So for example, a very common setting where this might occur is in transfer learning. Think about a data set where I have a camera that's sitting out in nature somewhere, and I very carefully, maybe I observe lots of animals walking past my my camera. One of my colleagues at MIT actually has collected a lot of data sets like this. So I know that, like, these, birds and squirrels, whatever, tend to walk past the camera at this position. This is what they look like. And now I take my camera and I put it somewhere else. If you think about it, my data set now has a different bias, right? Like, just by virtue of having moved my camera, things just look different in the background. Maybe the distribution of animals that I see is slightly different. And a very typical task I might want to do is to say, hey, if I train my machine learning model on this particular data set, do I expect it to work well on this other data set? Right? And so one way to do that might be to say, can I measure how similar these data sets are? Right? And there are many different places where exactly that task occurs. Another one might be if I'm comparing different machine learning models. For example, let's say that I train a neural network with many layers, and I want to know, like, if I train my neural network with 5 layers or 10 layers, have I actually learned something new, right? So one way that I might do that would be to take a data set and push it through these two different models, right? So now I get essentially 2 different embeddings of my data. I could compare these 2 things to say, like, do they have similar structure? In other words, like, have they basically learned the same thing? Or is there something fundamentally different about these 2 clouds of data points? So in this case, my task is not just to compare individual points, but rather to compare the structure of an entire data set at a time. Okay? So I guess I've already kind of set up this problem from a high level. Here's a sort of geometry picture of what this looks like. I have 2 different views, maybe of the same data set or of 2 different or 2 different data sets in 2 different spaces. And I can no longer map from one onto the other. Like in the previous paper that I told you about, I have the same kind of set of cells that's evolving over time, so it makes sense to compare them to each other. But here it could be, like layer 10 of my neural network is in dimension 15, and then layer 15 of my neural network is in some even higher dimensional space. So I can't map these things onto each other in any meaningful fashion. But what I can do is compare points to one another, right? So like in my space X, I can compare X's to X primes. In my space Y, I can compare Y's to Y primes. And I'd like to use these pairwise relationships to compare the data sets to each other. So we can call this a data set comparison problem. So for example, one place where this might occur in our previous example would be, let's say that I have a collection of cells and I forgot what day it was. And now I measure the gene expression and I want to know, like, where does it fall in this evolutionary process? So in this case, I have some experiments I've done with the day marked, and I'd like to know which one is the most similar to this new data set that I've collected. Okay? Now, in optimal transport, we can't quite solve that problem, right? When we talk about moving snow around, the baseline assumption is that the snow is moving around on the same ground. But instead, there's a different piece of machinery out there called the Gromov-Wasserstein problem, which is related to optimal transport, which kind of bypasses this particular issue. And the way that it does that is it says, rather than moving particles of snow around, we move to a different notion of comparison, where we say that 2 different data sets are similar if their distance structure is the same. Right? So in other words, for every pair of X and X prime, there exists a similar pair Y and Y prime in my other data set that has kind of similar distance to one another. If you're familiar with optimization, this feels like an easy problem or somehow comparable to what I told you before, but you move from the realm of convex problems to actually NP hard ones. These are very hard things to solve in practice. So even though these Gromov-Wasserstein problems are ones that have been posed and tackled in various fashion, for example, here I'm showing you some images from my own research group studying this particular problem, the reality is that these are really, really hard problems to solve. And so the question we wanted to answer is, can we tackle these data set comparison questions without needing to use such heavy-duty machinery? Like, what if we have to do this quickly and we don't want to solve some very large-scale optimization problem? So in order to do that, we're going to use a different corner of mathematics. This is known as spectral geometry. Roughly, in spectral geometry, I warned you, you asked for a math talk. We're gonna pull in lots of equations today. We're gonna use a very different notion of what it means to compare two different shapes. Are we okay?
Yes, we are almost okay. Can you hear me? We need a 1 minute break.
Oh.
We have a technical little minor problem, so please, those a minute and get your coffee or whatever. You can also get the water in the room, and we'll be back in a second. So I'm sorry to
No problem.
But you can,
I can take a break.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
I need to disturb you. We're back. Everything is fine. Our magician, Marcin, has found a problem, so I'm sorry again for disturbing you. But we're back, so
yeah, we're back.
continue. Thank you very much. And Michał had some comments meanwhile.
So, no.
Let's keep it for later.
Yeah, let's keep it for later.
Okay.
Oh, no, okay.
Okay. This will not be a technical break, but maybe this is a time for Michał.
Okay.
Is it?
Okay. I just was sharing my first thought about the great and overwhelming optimization problem, but since we are already back, I think we can go on. Can we?
Yes.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah.
Are we good? Did I manage to hurt the
Wszystko jest dobrze?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Welcome back.
What? Okay.
Hope everybody enjoyed the break. You got the coffee.
Yeah.
Right. So where were we?
Let's hit the rabbit. Let's hit the rabbit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So our task
Justin, wait, please. 1 second. It was turned off.
Yeah.
Now you can say that.
Yeah. All right. Now we're back.
Actually,
okay.
let's have an applause for Martin.
Yeah.
Yeah, and let's hit the rabbit.
Okay. Right. So our task was to compare data sets, and we're going to do that by applying a different area of math called spectral geometry. In case you're not familiar with this area of math, it has this history, again, in the kind of mid-1900s, I guess. And it dates back to an original mathematical problem, right, where the phrase that you hear a lot is, can you hear the shape of a drum? So the basic idea was this sort of hypothetical experiment that they carried out. Where the idea was that you find some surface and you knock on it, and you hear the sound that it makes. And so essentially you're just observing the vibration frequency from that sound, from that object rather. And then essentially the question is, can you reconstruct the shape just from the list of frequencies that object made? Now, mathematically, it's like one of those problems where you can't quite decide if it's easy or hard. Like on the one hand, like somehow it would be very convenient if this were true. For example, many of us are in machine learning, and one thing that we struggle with is to take an object and then create a feature out of it. So you can think of that list of vibration frequencies as a very convenient feature, right? It's like a one-dimensional vector of numbers that describes a shape, and shapes are hard to work with. So we like that. But it's not clear whether, for example, there are two objects that can be isospectral, right? In other words, that you hit them and they sound the same. Now, I encourage you all to try back in your office if you knock on different objects around the room. I think you'll find that it's very hard to find two things that sound the same. And indeed, in the mathematical theory of spectral geometry, what we find is that only happens in very, very special cases. Now, of course, this is originally a problem that was proposed to study just in 2 dimensions, like studying a drum. But we can also apply machinery of spectral geometry in high dimension as well. So in particular, we can take a data set, and we can compute things like its vibration structure and so on, using an object called the Laplacian operator, which is essentially just a matrix that we construct. So if we have a big data set, say of n points, then the very carefully constructed matrix that's n by n, whose eigenvalues and eigenvectors essentially tell us a lot about that data set. So in the spectral geometry universe, essentially the way that we're going to understand data sets is to very carefully construct a matrix that compares the data points to one another, and then to use the eigenvalues and eigenvectors of that matrix as somehow a means of actually comparing these objects. Okay, so that's the sort of high-level picture here. And some of the details don't matter so much. But essentially, the basic idea that this dates back to is in the area of something called diffusion maps. This was very popular in applied mathematics maybe 10, 15 years ago for folks to study, and what we're proposing is to use it for this particular machine learning task. So here, again, is a formula which I think the details are not so important, but essentially, actually, the reason to put this here is to convince you that these algorithms are extremely easy to implement. So remember that I told you there's just some matrix whose eigenvalues are the things that we're going to use to study our data. Here it is. Essentially, all you do is for every pair of data points, you just compute a Gaussian in their distance. So you compute how far apart they are and put them into this formula here. And then after a few basically normalizing calculations, what comes out is a matrix that approximates how heat might diffuse from one point to another under some assumption that it diffuses between objects that are nearby. And so essentially, the way that we can characterize an entire data set is to construct this n by n matrix. It's just a formula, and compute its eigenvalues. And those eigenvalues are going to be the objects that we study. Okay? And so this is going to be the way that we're going to compare different data sets to one another. You can think of them as sort of like there's some physical analogy, that two data sets are similar if the way that they conduct heat maybe is similar to one another. Those problems, that and spectral geometry, by the way, are very closely linked. So at the end of the day, what we propose to compare two data sets is to use something called a log Euclidean metric. The details here are, again, not so important. The high-level point here is that this is just linear algebra for comparing two data sets to one another. We construct these careful matrices, W1 and W2. These just come from diffusion structure. And then we actually take their log, which moves from heat kernels to vibration frequency, and compare those vectors of numbers to one another as a means of comparing the data sets. Now, kind of a nice thing is that we can this log Euclidean metric requires matching data points to one another. I need to know that like data point number 25 in the first data set corresponds to data point number 36 in the second data set or something like that. Like somebody has to actually identify a mapping from one into the other. Essentially, the mathematical contribution of this research is to show that we can bound this distribution using, or we can bound this value using a formula that does not depend on matching. In other words, I can get some distance between data sets without actually having to match them, which is where all the difficulty of this Gromov-Wasserstein problem I mentioned before comes from. So at the end of the day, the calculation here is extremely simple. You just compute these two matrices, you compute their eigenvalues, and you take their logs and subtract. That's it. And what we find is that this is actually competitive with some of these state-of-the-art tools for matching data sets in a very kind of inefficient and non-convex way. Maybe we'll skip over the details here, but essentially in the research paper, what I'll refer you to, if you just end up looking at algorithm 1, you don't care about the math at all. The good news is that's at about 10 lines of code to implement this thing and to actually give it a try. So I encourage you to give it a shot at home. And we show how you can use some randomized linear algebra techniques to solve this problem in very high dimension, which I know is a typical challenge that you face in practice. And so this is what leads us to this log Euclidean signature distance. There's some small details in the research paper that involve making sure basically when you take a log, you don't want to take the log of 0. And so we need to build in a displacement here. And that actually is sort of a mathematically well-justified thing to do. You don't want to just do this for a hack. You'd like to understand what these kinds of changes to your mathematical structure will have on the actual distances that you're computing. So here's an example data set. So here, we took that gene expression data set from the first paper that I told you about, and we just erased the days. So now we just have a bunch of collections of cells, each of which was allowed to evolve for some period of time, but we forgot how much time. And then the question was, can we predict the relationships between these data points? So in other words, like, can we recover the ordering of these data sets having forgotten it? And so essentially the way that we do that is for each experiment, remember this gives us a collection of gene expressions. We do this calculation, which gives us this vector of values, and now we can compare them to each other, and we can just embed, for example, in 1 or 2 dimensions based on comparing their eigenvalues. So what we expect is that if 2 collections of cells evolved for a similar period of time, then these feature vectors that we compute should be close to one another. And indeed, we find that that's the case, that with pretty, relatively good, I forget the right term here, with like in a pretty reliable fashion, we can recover this time axis that we forgot in our data set. Right, so in the research paper, we also show some other applications. For example, you can use this machinery to kind of understand if I have a neural network with 10 layers, like maybe layers 2, 5, and 9 are the ones that are actually doing something interesting to my data, like they're somehow reshaping it. And so the way that I can do that is by comparing the output of the different layers to one another applied to an entire data set. Right? So it might be that the data set looks similar for many layers of a network, and then so one of the layers is actually learning some new structure and reshapes my data. This kind of distance is quite sensitive to that sort of change. Okay, so at this point I've totally lost track of time given our little break there, but maybe we'll quickly summarize one more research paper from our group, and then we'll call it a day. Now here, we've studied kind of geometry problems applied to different objects, right? We started with data points, we moved to data sets. Now we're going to apply geometry to understand loss functions, right? So remember that most machine learning problems are accompanied with what you might call a loss function or an optimization objective, an energy function. These are all basically the same thing. The basic idea here is that you judge a machine learning model, for example, by its performance on a particular data set. Right? So you have some number that's telling you how well your model is performing, and then algorithms like stochastic gradient descent are basically intended to improve a model by sampling your data set and optimizing this loss. And so a very typical task here would be to understand the entire landscape of your loss function. Right? So maybe my loss has multiple optima, like there are multiple machine learning models that perform equally well on my data set. Then oftentimes one of the challenges is that I run this machine learning tool, I get one of these things, and I don't know what the entire space of different models is that look equally good. I just get one, right? And it's unpredictable which. And so essentially, what we've been studying recently in our research group is what we termed multi-solution optimization problems. So you have to be a little careful. There's also multi-objective optimization, which is related but not quite the same. And the basic idea of this MSO problem here is that you're given some loss function, some function f, right, which goes from the parameters of your machine learning model to just a number. And what you'd like to do is actually enumerate all of the different ways that I could optimize this thing, right? Like here are the 10 different machine learning models, for example, that explain my data equally well, at least given f as my measuring stick. So hopefully the basic problem makes sense here. And so unfortunately, this is a really hard problem to solve in practice. I mean, if you look at machine learning, just solving one optimization problem is already very challenging. And now we're looking to kind of enumerate all the different solutions when our problem has more than one. And in case that isn't challenging enough, there's actually kind of a fun variation of this problem, or maybe we have multiple loss functions. They're like parameterized by a vector tau, and I'd like to understand how the space of solutions to my problem changes as my parameter changes. This is actually a very typical setting, and one that I think we deal with in engineering quite a bit. So for example, maybe I would like my machine learning model to do well on a data set and also to be robust. Right? So now I have these two different losses, and of course, as I increase robustness, maybe I decrease performance. So there's some parameter tau here, which is the trade-off between these two things. This would be a multi-objective problem. And I'd like to know, like, what is the stability of the optimization solutions as I change my parameters around. These are the kinds of problems that we're trying to answer. Now, I don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. We're currently studying this problem in relatively low dimension, and I think there's really fantastic research challenges involving how do you take some of the machinery we're developing and apply them to these extremely high-dimensional problems which are common in modern machine learning. So here's a kind of fun example that my student Ling Xiao, who was the main person working on this problem, proposed as yet another place where this might occur. And that's in the space of object detection. So I think it was pointed out to me that I think the computer vision researchers are in the back right of this room. That's correct. Fantastic. So in computer vision, our problem looks something like this. Maybe I'm given an image. So here I have some office, and I'd like to simply put a box around all the different objects in the room. Okay? Now, as machine learning problems go, there are many data sets out there that look like this, right? There's just images with boxes labeled. But there are many challenges. For example, not every image has the same number of boxes in it. Those boxes don't come in a particular order. And so just representing this data and working with it is actually a little bit of a challenge. There's definitely some subtleties here. This doesn't feel like a multi-solution optimization problem, and it isn't a priori. But my student Ling Xiao actually found a really interesting way where you can encode it as one. So here, let's say that I have some pre-trained network that takes an image and maps it to some latent vector, right? There's many of these things out there that are trained on ImageNet or one of these big data sets that maps from images to some meaningful object. So here, maybe I use tau as that parameter. And I can actually cook up, let's say that I have an image with all the objects labeled inside of this image. So here, let's say that x is a box. So it's like the lower left corner and the upper right corner. Right? So for a given image, I can make a function f tau, which is the distance from any box to its closest box. Right? And if I optimize for that thing, I extract all the optima of this object, I get all the objects in my scene. Right? So if I somehow had access to this function given an image, which of course would be an optimistic thing to have access to, then a multi-solution optimization problem would actually extract the boxes for me. Now, of course, in practice, I don't have that, right? If I get a new image, I have no idea the distance to the closest box, because if I did, I would have solved the object detection problem. And so kind of a clever way to solve this, which is described in detail in this paper, is to actually kind of learn this function f given an image by encoding the image with some latent vector at the same time. And then at test time, I kind of predict this function f and solve the multi-solution optimization problem to extract all the boxes. Now, this feels complicated, but it actually has a lot of advantages. For example, I don't need to know a priori the number of objects in my scene, which is actually a kind of a challenge. If you're in computer vision area, you might be familiar with, there's some phrase they call like non-maximum suppression, which is basically like a posteriori cleaning up objects in an object detection task because you don't have a feature like this. So in order to study this multi-solution optimization problem, now we're going to study a very particular object in optimization. This is called the proximal operator associated to a given function. And this is where geometry comes in. So many of us are familiar with gradient descent algorithm, or stochastic gradient descent. For certain optimization problems, there's an alternative called proximal, sometimes proximal gradient descent, or the proximal point algorithm is the phrase we use, PPA. And this is some alternative to gradient descent that makes sort of stronger assumptions on the object that we have access to. So in particular, given a function f, this is my optimization objective here, I'm going to define a new function, which is called the proximal operator. And it sort of inputs a point x and a parameter tau. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah, sorry, the parameter tau is just for function f, so we can actually ignore it. I think it's just enough to have a point x. Okay, and given x, it itself solves an optimization problem, which is not just to minimize my function f, this is like what was before, but also to keep x close to our point that we're optimizing for, right? So it's some trade-off between finding the minimum of f and not moving too far away from x. Now, evaluating the proximal operator given f is sort of equally hard to just optimizing f for a lot of f's. I mean, in some sense, you wouldn't expect this problem to be any easier to solve. With the proximal point algorithm, the basic idea here is if I somehow had access to this proximal operator, I can do optimization by just applying prox many, many times. And that's because you can think of this as kind of like a gradient descent step, if you think about it. Like on the one hand, it wants to decrease the value of f. On the other hand, it wants to not move too far, right? And so one thing that you can actually argue here is that when lambda is large, so the distance parameter is big, then this becomes like a little infinitesimal step of gradient descent. And when lambda is small, this is like solving an optimization problem. So if I somehow had access to this proximal operator, I could apply it many times and do some analogy of gradient descent. Now, if you've taken numerical analysis or if you're familiar with physical simulation, this is like the difference between forward and backward Euler integration is another way to think about this problem. But in any event, basically, the proximal point algorithm, when it was classically proposed, the basic idea was that for certain objective functions, f, you can work out this proximal operator in closed form. And so for like L1 regression, for example, this is a very popular example. This is one approach to solve this problem. Unfortunately, so our idea for multi-solution optimization might be to sample many points x, and then just apply this proximal operator to them many, many times. And then all of those points kind of will slowly cluster at the local optima of my problem. That's fantastic. The only problem is we don't have access to this proximal operator. And so essentially the problem that we try to tackle in this particular research paper is how can we come up with some approximation of this function prox that we can evaluate very quickly and at low cost, given our optimization objective f. Okay? So this is our basic task here. From a machine learning perspective, it's actually kind of, there's some interesting fashion in which we can formulate this particular problem. So what we're going to do is we're going to approximate this proximal operator with a neural network. Then the question becomes, what is our objective function for training that network? Okay? So here, our proximal operator, I'm sorry, the glare from this light is a little tricky for me to actually read the screen. The proximal operator we'll call phi here. So this is our approximation. And now if you look at just the inner part of this expectation, you'll see that it's exactly the same as the problem I wrote on the previous slide. And so the basic idea here is that I'd like my proximal operator phi to work well for all data points x and all parameters tau. And so the way that I'm going to do that is just average my objective function over all possible inputs to this thing. Now, what you can convince yourself is that if phi can be literally any function, which is of course not the case. We're going to restrict to like neural network of some case. But if my neural network were infinitely wide and infinitely expressive, you can argue that this object really does converge to the proximal operator. But in practice, what we do is we have phi as some neural network with a finite number of parameters. And training this object is actually relatively straightforward. We just randomly sample x tau pairs many, many times and do stochastic gradient descent to optimize the parameters of this function phi. So this is kind of an interesting object we actually have access to, which is a little surprising, which is the proximal operator associated with an optimization problem. And so now we have a generative model for this multi-solution optimization problem, which is actually not so hard to use in practice. So as an initial step, we train our operator phi. And now we just randomly generate a bunch of data points completely just scattered in our space. And we just apply phi to them many times, many here being 10. Turns out is roughly sufficient for most of the applications we consider. And then what we find is that those points cluster at the different optima of our problem. And so this is actually a pretty straightforward algorithm for this multi-solution problem, at least in low dimension. In high dimension, it becomes more difficult to train this object phi, and there's some interesting research problems to be tackled there. So here's a very simple example of what this looks like. So rather than dealing with neural networks and all these complicated things, we'll start with something a little bit simpler than that, which is called sparse recovery. This, by the way, like if you took machine learning 20 years ago, would be the problem that I think you'd spend most of your time on. So let's say that I wanted to solve a linear algebra problem, like ax equals b. but at the same time, I want x to be sparse. So I have some term that promotes x having zeros in it. So think about like, I'm doing regression, I'm trying to explain a data set, and I suspect that not too many factors in my feature vector actually affect my data. So I'd like to zero many of them out. So a very typical way to do that would be to trade off between fitting my data and some term promoting sparsity. So this is a problem that is non-convex, at least when this power p is less than 1. And so you might want to solve this and to essentially enumerate all the different models that maybe have the same amount of sparsity and explain my data equally well. So in other words, they all optimize f the same amount. But at the same time, depending on where I started my training procedure for my machine learning task, I might get one or the other. This is a very typical situation, right? Like maybe I send out, I collect a bunch of medical data, and actually there's many different factors that are predictive of the same medical condition, and so any one of them would be sufficient to explain my data set. So depending on, how I initialized my model, I might converge on different ones. And it would be good to know all my different options. So essentially, we can apply our algorithm to exactly this task. And what we find is that it pretty reliably can reconstruct all the different solutions to this problem in, again, a relatively simple manner. You just train this neural network and then apply it many times. Or similarly here, if we go back to our original motivating example, we can carry out object detection and images. So at test time, it's kind of fun to see what this looks like. So you just randomly scatter a bunch of object boxes on your image. You apply this proximal operator, which is learned to it a few times, and then they all kind of converge on boxes that are around the actual objects in your scene. This is kind of a fun task that's a little bit more complicated because the function f, at test time, you actually don't have access to it. So you actually have to infer what that function that you're optimizing looks like at the same time as optimizing it, which is an interesting task. Now, this is just the beginning of this multi-solution optimization problem. This is a relatively new one. It actually was kind of inspired by some grant calls that were in the United States for research that the folks actually cared about for some machine learning models. And now, of course, we're studying many problems that are related to this. Like, can we couple this problem with some of the other papers that I told you about? In particular, remember that proximal operator is trade-off between two terms, like the optimization objective and distance. And of course, we could try to learn that distance at the same time. We might also want to apply this to like multi-objective optimization problems. So like navigating this Pareto frontier of trade-offs, for example, between, robustness, performance, and some other considerations in your model. And then we're also looking at different applications of this machinery. Actually, just a few days ago, we had a research paper that was accepted in a very different domain, which is computer graphics, which uses exactly the same machinery applied to a very different problem, which is reduced order modeling in physics. One thing is if you look very closely at certain equations of motion in physics, you see they're also applying some version of proximal operator. So you can use essentially the same inference procedure to come up with different ways to predict behavior of a physical system. This is a bit of a surprise of an application that we didn't expect when we started this work. In any event, I think I've used enough of your time. So to summarize a little bit, hopefully we've seen at least at a high level that geometry and geometric reasoning can be applied to a number of different tasks in machine learning, data analysis, and actually understanding models themselves. And I think these are really just exemplary of a number of different situations where geometry gives us some means of comparing, right? Comparing data sets, comparing data points, and so on. But of course, there's many different notions of geometry to choose from. And I think where a lot of the interesting problems that we need to study are how to identify and find that geometric structure in some of these more abstract settings. So with that, maybe we'll conclude for now. It's my pleasure to answer any questions that you have now. And I'll also be around Warsaw, I guess, today and tomorrow. I don't know exactly what the schedule is, but it's my pleasure to grab coffee with any of you and learn a little bit more about your research. So thank you very much for your time. And it's such a pleasure to be here today.
Thank you. Yeah, please, please.
Before I give the floor to Michał and to Justin again, I will ask you that maybe you want to start with a question, any of you.
Don't all speak at once here.
Not yet. Okay, Michał.
Yeah, I believe the question will follow. So first of all, congratulations on wonderful work, very inspiring. A lot of wonderful ideas and ideas that are so inspiring that actually in my head already they are defining research programs for some of you, my dear.
Oh, I'm intrigued by what's on this, this notebook here.
I've made notes, and so I have a bunch of technical questions. Well, the first, but let me start with first impression. I love the last part that you showed, that you can actually learn the proximal operator, and if I understand it correctly, you can reconstruct the closed form solutions defining proximal operators for certain types of optimization problems.
Yeah, so that's the sort of classical approach, right? So a lot of time, I think, you know, when people were studying problems like sparsity, sparse regression, L1 regularized things, this is a very typical optimization algorithm they use, right? Was proximal point. In this paper, we're sort of distancing ourselves from that, right? We're saying, like, rather than, you know, relying on a mathematician to work out a formula for a very special case, like, can we just regress that operation?
It's fantastic. We did some work in this area. So we started with alternative directives multiply methods that lead to proximal operators in applications to compressive sensing or some L1 norm optimization in our control problem, signal separation problems in applications in cybersecurity. But there we used these subdifferential-based closed form solutions.
If you're lucky, then you can do that, right?
Yeah, but if we're lucky, and now you are giving us the recipe for dealing with problems where there's no way to do that.
It's an interesting setup. Yeah, it's also so in the research paper itself. It's not something that we can cover here. My student Ling Xiao, who worked on this, is a brilliant mathematician and actually worked through a lot of the theory involving, so like the algorithms you mentioned, like ADMM and so on, rely on having a precise proximal operator or some object that's kind of similar. One thing that you can show is that even if your proximal operators are proximate, these things can still converge to a reasonable solution to your problem.
That's wonderful.
And so there's actually some useful theory out there you can borrow to kind of apply to this setting.
And the title of the paper, data-free learning, that's like.
That's in physics, yeah.
Yeah, that's sensational.
A bit of a different setting, but yeah.
It's a great title, and I definitely am going to dig into that in more details. I have questions about these three sets of topics, and if we can we please get back to the one regularized Kantorovich problem where you are.
Oh sure. Do you want slides? I guess.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just go to the computer really quick.
Okay. Actually, we can.
Oh my goodness, he's taking control.
Actually, I'm switching to your slides right now.
Technology.
I know.
My laptop is here.
Okay.
Oh, you've got that.
Yeah, I got this one.
Okay.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask about the transport cost, as I understand, the phi function that you are optimizing for. So can you explain the constraint that you have the norm of the gradient, with respect to this metric less than 1? What is why?
Okay. Right. So that's let's see. Yeah, you guys offered writing on the board before, and I declined, but it would probably be easier. No, that's okay. Right. So let's see here. So in the transport problem. So this is the dual of the transport problem.
Okay.
Right. So there's typically I'm trying to think of the best intuition here, and I'm failing, but I can tell you formally. Right. So essentially, in the primal version of the transport problem, there's this function pi, which is the amount of mass that I pick up and drop off.
Okay. So
in the dual, that doesn't exist anymore. There's a different function, which is phi here, which is the thing that you're optimizing for.
Yeah.
So this is actually not the transport cost, right? Because that's sort of a fixed object.
Okay.
But rather, phi is it's like a pricing problem, which is a little tricky. But the essential high-level point here is that for the one Wasserstein problem, which means that your transport, like the cost of moving things from A to B is the distance from A to B.
Okay.
In the dual, what you optimize for is a function phi, where you integrate it against your two measures subtracted from one another.
Okay.
with the constraint that phi is Lipschitz. So in other words, that the gradient is bounded less than 1.
Okay.
In our setting, that's really convenient because we're optimizing for Riemannian metric. So that's our variable is really this matrix A. Which, and so the constraint that something is Lipschitz is just basically changing the norm on A.
Okay, so, and
so
A
it's a bit of a detail, but I'm happy to. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So and that's and A is from RD to it's a semi-definite.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. So in practice, A is actually just a neural network that takes in a data point X and gives back a semi-definite matrix, which is an easy thing to do. That basically says like what are the directions that I think my data can move and where should it not.
Yeah, and so how did and the phi defines this vector field that you then that defines this geometry. Do I understand it correctly?
Roughly. So phi is actually a scalar field, but its gradient is a vector field, and the gradient is sort of telling you where the mass is moving in your transport problem. Yeah. There's a lot of structure that's known about phi and the theory of transport, right? Yeah. It's at least when A is the identity matrix, phi is a convex function, and its gradient is the transport map.
And is this something that you can also solve with a proximal operator or a DMM-like algorithm? How do you solve that?
It's a good question. So if I like took this problem and I put it on a grid, then the answer would be yes. That was the sort of state of the art for optimal transport maybe 10 years ago.
Okay.
These days, because of the high dimensional setting of this problem, we're trying to avoid that.
Okay.
Right? And so the sort of modern approach that folks use is sort of some trade-off, because now you're going to get rid of the nice convex structure which exists in these transport problems by using like a neural network to parameterize your variable. On the other hand, you can solve it in a very high dimensional setting. So there's a number of research papers that do that recently and propose some pretty stable ways to solve that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, it is. I'm really overwhelmed by the fact that you can write this problem, solve it, and that you can infer the evolution of this data set, and so that's fantastic. Are there any questions regarding this part? Because I have the other.
I think there are. There is a question on YouTube. So Bartosz is asking, have you tried to apply your solutions to test the robustness of machine learning models to anomalies, adversarial attacks? That's the question of Bartosz.
Interesting. I mean, my short answer is no. Sorry, Bartosz. No, they're actually in robust machine learning. A very similar machinery does get used. Actually, our group has a project. It's published in JMLR, which is Journal of Machine Learning Research, that studies exactly this. So there's sort of two sides of the coin. Unfortunately, I'm going to probably not answer the question that he actually had, and instead answer the question that I'd like him to ask. And on the one hand, you could try to study robustness of machine learning models by like identifying data points or regions of your data set where things don't work well. For example, my colleague Misha Yuroshkin at IBM studies a related problem which has to do with bias and for example, like just because a model does really well on a whole data set, maybe it systematically does poorly on some subset, and I'd like to avoid that or remove features that I shouldn't be discriminating against. A different question you could answer is, how do I train a machine learning model to be robust to changes, whether they're adversarial or just things that happen over time? And actually there, the theory of optimal transport is quite relevant. So our group has studied models where essentially what you do typically is you optimize your loss function sort of averaged over an entire data set. The adversarial version of this problem might say that an adversary can come in and take your data set and move it around a little bit to make your model perform worse, right? So this is kind of like a minimax setting, right? So I play a game where I propose a machine learning model, and then you propose a data set that makes my model look bad, right? And of course, it's easy to do that if there's no constraints at all, right? I just find one data point that is misclassified. But the notion is like, what does it mean to adversarially generate a data set, but also have it be close to the original one? And one of the ways that people do that is using this transport machinery. So if you think of your data set as sampled from some data generating probability distribution, then maybe you'd like to be robust against an adversary that can generate another distribution of data that's not too far away. And it's actually a very well studied problem. This is called Wasserstein distributionally robust optimization. Our group, that's a problem that's not just in our group, many people study. We studied sort of how do you make it practical, because what you find is that oftentimes when you want to make your model robust, even just by a little bit, I mean, the space of adversaries is so large that the performance goes to like 0 or like only slightly better than random. And so we were kind of studying problems involving like how can you build in a little bit of ground truth to make the certainty a lot higher. But anyway, there are a lot of great problems in this space. So, I'm sure that didn't answer the question, but I'm happy to pontificate. Yeah.
Any other?
Are there any other questions? Any other questions? Please wait.
So I was thinking about the practical aspect of these models. Like, for instance, my question is, how many data points do you need for a good predictions? Because, for instance, I'm working on the medical data, and we are faced with very small data sets, sometimes like data from 5-6 patients, and we need to predict. And if you want to make some more abstract predictions, like for instance to see the change in the biological neural networks over the course of the disease or something, you have really limited amount of data. So how many data?
I mean, I think oftentimes you get the questions about scalability, which is sort of the opposite side. You know, your data set is so large you don't know how to deal with it. But in medical settings, it's very common, right? You only have so many data points. Oftentimes, the only data points you get are anomalies. You know, at the end of the day, you know, we can't overcome statistics, you know, like if you don't observe things in your data or it's a very rare event or so on, I don't think any of these methods will work very well.
But for sure there is potential for data augmentation, right?
That's true. So data augmentation material is some way to synthetically make your data set larger. You have to be careful though, because essentially then what you're doing as a researcher is you're putting some ansatz on how you think your data should change. It's not clear whether you're learning from your data or you're learning from the intuition that you put into your augmentation tool. In some settings that's reasonable, like if there are invariances that your data has that you expect. So for example, in computer vision, maybe they like take images, they rotate them, translate them, scale up and down, and you don't expect your model to change. I'm not a domain expert in medical data, so it's hard for me to know, but it seems much harder to come up with augmentation techniques. My student Ricard, actually, he just posted like a couple days ago some kind of a fun piece of research in that direction where the question was, can you come up with generic strategies for augmentation that don't rely so much on the researcher intuition? And his argument is that a lot of machine learning architectures actually encode some interesting structures. So for example, for images, we typically use these convolutional neural networks, and the way that convolution is designed already is telling us a lot about how we expect images to be processed and understood. And so maybe the structure of the network gives us some clues as to how we can augment our data. Similarly, in graph neural networks, right, there's certain kind of structures that are being leveraged. So Ricard has proposed some strategies for augmentation that just look at the structure, like the network structure itself, and then try to kind of randomize it a little bit. But these are very new ideas. If you ping me, I can share a link. But this is like literally a couple days ago.
Seems like interesting.
Your timing is good.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else with questions?
Hello, but can we skip to the data sets comparisons, or
sure.
are we still?
Okay.
Yeah. No, you don't. No, I mean, you don't have to show it. I just have a question about that. I was just basically asking Michał if you can
I'm sorry.
move on to the other section now. Is okay.
Yeah,
okay.
So tell me
He's driving the car here.
Okay. First of all, I just wanted to thank you. It was like super inspiring talk.
Thank you.
And your energy is also inspiring. I mean, it's just, I haven't been using MATLAB for, I don't know, years, but you kind of made me, want to run it right away. So, so it's really well. I work in NLP, so natural language processing, right? And I didn't see really any examples from you coming from this field, but I'm pretty sure there are some applications too. I was wondering, couple of months or actually years ago, I was playing with the static embeddings like word2vec. You know what the structure is, right? It's like the weights from this shallow neural networks, and if you have this pre-trained model, you have like the dictionary of some vectors that describe the words, right? And I was playing with them. I want to see what can I do to them to maintain the meaning that the classification will be still okay, but for example, the dimension will be reduced, or if I change, how much can I change to still get the results? And actually the motivation was I wanted to make them non-interpretable for humans anymore, but still working for the classification. We used to just work with some non-legal, very bad, harmful data, so I didn't want to have access to the meaning, like the actual meaning. And I was trying to just reduce the dimension. It turns out you can take half of it, like for example, 50 features out of 100, and still works very well. So they're pretty redundant, but then you will still infer what the word was, because the most similar vector would be still the same, like the original one. So I was trying to do more. I was treating them as signals, and applied some filters, like this low band filter, for example, but it was the same. So you get the classification was still good, but the most similar vector was still the original one. Then I applied Fourier transform to this one.
Fourier transform to the elements of the embedding?
To the vector, yeah. I was treating it as a signal,
But Fourier transform needs like an axis, right?
I was treating the values as points in time. Like the next value was as the next sample in time, which it's not true. But I was just trying to see how that works. Okay. And the result was if you apply the Fourier transform, you still get the classification. The classification is still very well, and still. Even though it's transformed, the most similar vector is still the original one.
Oh, of course, right? This is what's-his-face's theorem, Plancherel, right? That the distance between two objects and the distance between their Fourier transform is the same.
Yes. Yeah. So this is. Then I just took the real part of the Fourier transform. Okay. So I ditched the other one, and you still get very good results, and still the vector is the most similar to itself.
Okay.
And and I was wondering. I mean, I had this feeling that it's because the structure of the datasets is the same. It's like they were very, I don't know, they were kind of rotated and more densified, but the inner structure was probably the same. And I was thinking, and the final result was if you take the absolute value of the real part, then you have the result. So you have still good classification, but it's not close to itself at all, but it's different part. But I was thinking about this real part or this Fourier transform frame. If I could apply your method or just the geometry method of comparing two dataset, because I was lacking the method to say why they are performing so well and why they are still so close to, I mean, why they are still understandable. I was just, I didn't have the tool. And now I was like, okay, maybe I should just measure the inner structure. What do you think?
So I'm not sure I can comment on the Fourier aspect. Yeah, but sure, I mean, absolutely. These distances, the point here is to compare data sets for embeddings, right? And so it makes perfect sense to, at the very least, you should be able to say like, after I applied this operation to my data set, now it's just structured very differently, right? In your case, you have an advantage that we don't have in this work, which is a mapping, right? Like, you know that, like, maybe you're trying to destroy the structure, but you do know, like, word number 15 in my corrupted data set is the same as word number 15 in the original one. So, like, for example, in this paper, we have all these lower bounds. They wouldn't be relevant in your case. You could just compute the true distance instead, which is good. That's a more sensitive object, right? That you expect to do better. But absolutely, this is the kind of literature that would be used. Regarding the original problem, it would be a challenge to me to think about, because it seems like you're trying to do the opposite of what we usually do, which is to preserve geometric structure as we reduce dimensionality, which is interesting. I mean, my inclination, having thought about your problem for 10 seconds, so of course I have no expertise, you're the expert here, would be to look in like differential privacy and these sort of spaces where people want to, like for example, in a very different research project, our group has collaborated with people at the census to do like political redistricting in the United States. And they recently implemented differential privacy, so that you want to like corrupt census data so that you can't reconstruct anything about a given person in a census tract, but you still can do reasonable statistics.
Yeah, because the thing is you cannot reverse the real part of a Fourier transform. You just cannot do this.
Right, it's called phase retrieval, right?
Yeah. But have you worked in any way in language data, like language embedding?
I mean, not any. We've used that some language data just as like one example of many, but I can't say we have strong expertise. So yeah, I think that's likely to change because it seems to be a very popular topic to study. But for now, certainly, yeah, I don't want to claim any expertise we don't have here.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Michał. Maybe we can come back to you because I guess you have still thousands of questions.
Yeah. So the key question is how much your work in spectral geometry is inspired by your musical inspirations and playing cello. Yeah.
Well, sadly, the reality of these spectral calculations, even in 2 dimensions, that they have very little to do with acoustics. You know, that's every year I ask my students to try that experiment, and it doesn't work. You know.
We have a great scientific center called Copernicus Center. So I encourage you to visit. And there's a place where you can play with eigenfunctions. So actually, the picture that you showed, the table or something with sand on it that vibrates, and you can see eigenfunctions on it. So you will see children there, and every now and then you'll see an adult person that takes the children away and looks at it, and you know that's a mathematician, you know, because he looks at the eigenfunctions and tries to.
It's I'm told that like very expensive instrument repair sometimes will do a very similar experiment. They'll like put sand on the instrument and kind of tap at it to find the nodes of Laplace eigenfunction. Yeah. I've never seen somebody actually do this in practice.
Okay.
Certainly not for my cheap repair.
In this particular example that we see now, so the W is there an incidence matrix or
so there's no graph on your data, and in diffusion maps your graph is complete. You just between every pair of points you compute a Gaussian. Although in a sense it's like a weighted graph, right? Because of course those weights are large when things are close by.
And so the Laplacian, is it derived from the graph structure, or is it?
So we want to avoid a graph structure here, so there isn't one. So this particular formula, so my postdoc Tal Schnitzer, who is the main person working on this, is an expert in this diffusion maps machinery. There's like a lot of different formulas out there, which to me look the same, but I guess in practice are quite different. People tend to approximate 2 different objects. There's something called the heat kernel, and something called the Laplacian. These are related to each other in linear algebra by an exponential. Apparently what works most stably on datasets is what we're showing here, where the W, I believe, is, sorry, I'm looking really quick. Yeah, so W here is not Laplace operator, it's actually the heat diffusion operator. You would get the Laplacian by roughly just subtracting the row sums from this matrix. But there are a bunch of different related objects that are all just kind of different formulas. If you go on Wikipedia for Laplacian, you'll see there's like 20 of them that all behave very similarly. You have to be. I keep making mistakes when I write this stuff down because you have to be a little bit careful with whose eigenvalues you're computing. But
speaking about eigenvalues, the problem, so the distance that you define with working with this model is a difference between logs of eigenvalues.
That's right.
So why logs?
Yeah, so that's a subtlety here. So this is the log Euclidean metric between matrices. But essentially, because W is heat diffusion, the logs of those eigenvalues end up being Laplace eigenvalues. But you have to be careful because, so this is a mathematical detail, but if you're familiar with the Weyl formula, essentially Laplacian eigenvalues diverge. They go off to infinity. And so like essentially in practice this would be a problem. You make your data set larger and then this distance just grows. And so to tackle that, essentially there's that little offset that's built into that formula. That's not just a numerical hack, it also makes sure that this value converges. Like that you don't, you know, if you make your data set larger, this thing converges to a distance that makes sense in the continuum. So anyway, there's a lot of details here to make this thing well posed. But the high level intuition is pretty straightforward.
But it looks really, looks like an elegant solution.
Okay, we have still 5 more minutes, so I think that's the time for the last question.
Hi, I'm Karina from Nask. Thank you very much for your lovely lecture. And since you explicitly said at the beginning that you welcome all sorts of questions
Please.
from all areas of expertise, I have two questions. One is more of philosophical nature, perhaps sociological than mathematical. In your presentation, you showed a couple of examples how you apply your analysis to data sets such as human body. Have you or anyone from your team had a chance to reflect on how class, race, gender, ableist bias can potentially misinform your research methods or assumptions, and do you apply any measures to control it in any way, in any ways if it's needed? And my second question is more general. What do you think about the intensive commercial development of AI, generative AI nowadays? Yeah.
Okay, so let's see. How many hours do we have here? Right. So let's see. I'll separate out the details in these papers and then some high-level things. So in these research papers, I mean, the short answer, I should be clear, is no. Like these are important considerations, and they're not ones that are carefully thought about here. And I think actually that's sort of justified only in the sense the data sets that we're testing on, I don't think for the most part are, for example, like face recognition or like the typical things that cause these issues. But of course, they're very important to be cognizant of. I do want to bring your attention, my student Anna Dodic actually had a really fantastic presentation at the ACM SIGGRAPH conference last year. She and her collaborator Sylvia Seyan and some other folks studied specifically these questions as they pertain to gender, and which is a fantastic example where things can really go wrong. So for example, in these generative modeling tasks, a lot of them are built on some baseline assumption that there's like a clearly defined gender binary, that you can get this by looking at an image and so on. And of course, these are things that we really need to revisit. These data sets are, never mind just unreliable, like the baseline premise of how they were constructed really doesn't make sense. So they have all kinds of interesting research where they've just tracked through the history of computer graphics techniques and how these sort of synthesized images, you know, the algorithms we use to generate them are really predicated on assumptions that both from a data set perspective and also a modeling perspective are really ones that are to call them shaky wouldn't give credit to the problems that are hiding there. Similarly, our colleague Misha at IBM, Misha Yuroshkin, is studying exactly these kinds of questions from a different perspective, which is if there are certain protected attributes in your data, how can you quotient those out before you train your machine learning problem? He has some really cool research involving building metrics, so like ways to compare data points, just like what we're talking about here, where you want to ensure that they're insensitive to certain features. So for example, if I'm trying to train a machine learning model to evaluate somebody for a loan, then of course I don't want that model to be sensitive to race or gender. But there's a problem, which is that it's very easy to find things that are correlated with those two things. So a good example in medical data, you know, is that for whatever reason, you know, different subpopulations of people are more or less likely to smoke. And so you might be able to find some proxy for gender or race based on features that you really don't think of as being correlated to that. And then you have to ask a question like, is that relevant to my machine learning model or not, right? For, you know, evaluating somebody whether they should get a mortgage, you know, you probably can remove that smoking feature. If it's for a medical task, then the answer might be no, that actually is a relevant thing. So there's some really subtle questions there that affect the geometry of your data set and are really important to build into some of these models here. So my short answer is like, no, these particular research papers, you know, acknowledge and discuss some of these challenges, but don't build them into the model. The larger perspective is that these are really critical things to study, and I think they're being revisited the last year or two. Generative AI is one of the fantastic examples where essentially you see all the biases in your data set just get reflected right back at the viewer in some really problematic ways. I mean, there's so many different places where you see this. And as one of the people, you know, I'm in this talk, it's probably less obvious, but actually one of my main areas of research is in computer graphics. This is something we worry about quite a bit. And actually on the academic side, you have to ask questions about how do you review these academic papers? How do you understand and orthogonalize the contribution technically from how they designed their data set? Did they do an ethical job of that? And so on. And how do you share? Now let's see, your second question was the availability and proliferation of generative modeling in industry. I hesitate to comment on that only because it really isn't my area of expertise, although it's been a fun area to watch from the outside looking in. I think as it pertains to your first question, there's a lot of great, when you make these models publicly available, how people use them in the laboratory and how they use them in real life are very different. And I think we're seeing that just in the last couple of weeks. I mean, in the United States, we've had some interesting examples, for example, of, right, there are all these deep fake photographs of Trump running away from the police, which of course are completely synthesized by an AI model. I think we're going to have a lot of discussion to be had in the very near future about things that we used to think of as relatively trustworthy, like we use images in court cases, maybe become less so, and how to navigate that and do forensics and how to allow people to use these tools or not, I think are questions that remain unanswered. Never mind from the artistic side, questions of attribution and so on are also quite complicated. So essentially my answer to you is no, I wish I could answer any of these questions. All I can do is acknowledge that they're really, really hard, but one thing I can do is at the very least promote my student Anna's work, which is one small perspective into this space, which I think is asking some really important questions, at least in the sort of gender part of that larger constellation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to those of you who asked questions, who came here, who were watching us. There were some people. And please make use of Justin's stay in Warsaw. As you said at the beginning, that you welcome any new points in your agenda. That's fantastic. Thank you very much. That's not the last seminar that we have in this series. So the next one is with your colleague from MIT CSAIL, with Jesse Michel, who is a PhD student. So it's on the 13th of April at 3:30 p.m. It will be on Teams, so it will not be, unfortunately, not in Warsaw. Yeah. But thank you very much. Thank you all, and see you very soon. Thank you, YouTube people, also for joining us. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.